Hey, Margie here. Are you ready to delve into the thyroid today? Because so many of us have thyroid issues, and the incidence has tripled since the 1990s. The good news is there's a lot we can do, and something that really isn't talked about that's been shown in the research is by reducing our iodine. That can have a major positive effect on our thyroid. So today we have a very special guest, Dr. Alan Christianson. And Dr. Christianson is a board certified naturopathic endocrinologist who focuses on thyroid care. He is a New York Times best-selling author whose recent titles include the Thyroid Reset Diet. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And Dr. Christianson has been featured on countless media appearances, including Dr. Oz, The Doctors, The Today Show. He's the founding president behind the American College of Thyroidology and the Endocrine Association of Naturopathic Physicians. In this episode, Dr. Christianson explains his thyroid reset diet plan and how lowering iodine can prevent thyroid disease and even keep existing disease from progressing. This talk is filled with lots of information we could all put into our lives. So stay tuned. Welcome, Dr. C. I'm really happy to have you on the podcast. And this is such an important topic, and you have amazing information. So welcome, welcome.
Oh, Margie, glad to be with you. And bones are a very important topic that's underappreciated. So I'm glad to be here with you.
Oh, well, thanks so much. Well, you know what? Why don't we just beforehand, I always love to hear the backstory. Just tell us like how you got into working with the thyroid and being so passionate about it.
It's kind of unusual timing, I guess. I was in my my residency in the early 90s, and the conventional world back then, now we'll talk about ways in which it can be underdiagnosed, undertreated. It was even worse then by a lot. And there were some very extreme ideas in natural medicine. And I saw these different views that were just worlds apart. And I could see some things that made sense in each, but shortcomings in each as well. And thyroid disease was just starting to pick up then. So yeah, I really connected with those who were struggling with it, and it became a real passion of mine 25 years ago.
Wow. And I guess also when you have the reinforcement that people get better,
Yeah, for
right?
sure.
That makes you want to continue with this incredible work. It's just unbelievable. I mean, thyroid disease, cancer, Hashimoto's, hyperthyroidism, it's tripled since the 1990s. Why do you think that is?
Well, we'll talk a lot about this, but it corresponds with change in global and American iodine intake. Our American intake has roughly tripled, and globally, iodine deficiency is gone, but now many areas are at iodine excess, including the United States.
So wait, everybody, are you listening? Because this is not something that is typically out there. Oh yeah, it's because of iodine. So why don't you fill us in? Because I think a lot of people think that was the problem originally. There wasn't enough iodine. So why don't you just maybe give us just talk to us about the history from this iodine and how you got to where you're at right now with the iodine.
Yeah, for sure. And you can get too little. That's happened in the past. As recently as 1992, there was 112 nations categorized as severely iodine deficient, and there was tons of health problems in those places. By the time 2014 rolled around, that 112 number was reduced down to zero, which was a really big win for public health. But many places overcorrected. So now there's 52 nations on the globe that are at risk for excess. And we see this even like when we started fortifying. So in 1924, the United States started fortifying salt with iodine. Well, actually, I shouldn't say United States. It was not a concerted national effort, but that came about because of pediatric goiter. So there's levels of deficiency that if they're far enough, they will affect people of all ages. Like if they're less than about 20 micrograms per day, that's pretty rare. What was happening in the United States back then is that many areas were less than about 50 to 20. And at that point, actually adults are usually fine, but kids do get higher rates of thyroid swelling, and that can show up and persist through adolescence. So when World War I came around, they were looking at soldiers and doing physical therapists. They were looking for scoliosis, but they'd also do quick checks for goiter. And far too many were rejected due to goiter. And that's what caused the impetus for fortification. And the goiter rate plummeted. That was also a success. It went from like 35% in some areas down to 2 to 3%. However, the rate of autoimmune thyroid disease, before we got on, we were talking about Hashimoto's. And that's the most common kind of thyroid disease in the modern world. The rates of it in the years after iodine fortification in the United States went up 26 fold, 26 times.
Oh my.
And that's the theme is iodine is this crazy thing to where it's got such a narrow range. There's not a big difference between one person to the next in terms of how much they require, but there's a big difference in terms of how much we can tolerate. And many people can tolerate extra and do fine with it. They're not the ones who are going to get thyroid disease, but those susceptible to thyroid disease are the ones that cannot tolerate the excesses.
That's so interesting. And how would a person, let's say they're subclinical, they don't have any symptoms whatsoever. How would they know in terms of if they're having an issue with iodine?
Well, really, it shows up by the development of thyroid disease. So
Hmm.
if someone's not in that continuum, it's less likely for them. But there's really not good ways of tracking otherwise. We can talk about testing, and the issue is that iodine is in the blood, in the urine, and in the thyroid. There's these three compartments, and if it's building up in the thyroid, that doesn't show up readily in other testing compartments. So one can measure for that. And most tests that are done are accurate when they're done at a population level. We can do most any test and see if 500 people are, above, below target or whatever. But all those tests break down at the individual level because there's so much variation just from sample to sample.
So let's tell us like why the iodine is such an issue. What is it actually doing to the thyroid that we have to be so concerned about it?
This is the thing. A lot of research has just decided to make a hard effort to understand the real causes of thyroid disease. And what they found is that there's basically two causes that are of the top three that are called existential. And that's age and gender. So the older we are, and then women over men, we see higher rates of that. Then there's all the causes that are things we can control. And of those, researchers have stated that iodine is not the only one, but it's more important than all the other causes combined. So it's a big deal. And the reason for that is now how we understand thyroid disease to start. So iodine itself, it's kind of like bleach. It's a very useful chemical, but it's also a dangerous thing. It makes free radicals when there's too much of it. And we need it for the thyroid to form the hormones. So we pull it in the thyroid and it sticks on a protein called thyroglobulin and we make our thyroid hormones. So that's a happy story. If you get a little too much, however, the extra iodine doesn't really have safe ways to get processed and it creates free radical damage. It can damage the proteins of the thyroid and it can create a lot of extra cell death as well. That's the first step. Once that gets going, then the immune system becomes alerted and lymphocytes, one of our white blood cells, they get drawn into the thyroid. They see these thyroid proteins that are deformed and damaged and all this extra iodine on those, and they act as if they're foreign. It's called autoantigenicity. So the body treats these innate cells as if they're foreign antigens. And now we start getting immune attacks against thyroglobulin, thyroid peroxidase, and it slows it down. So that's how thyroid disease starts. And for a long time, we thought that once that process got underway, it was just kind of a done deal that it would just keep going on its own accord. But now there's data saying that if you can really treat that cause and eliminate that extra iodine, it can often reverse itself.
Isn't that incredible? It's interesting. I'm so interested because I had Hashimoto's and really just exactly what you said, that not faulting anyone, but this has just been what's been done in medicine is that when you find out, and I had no symptoms, just blood work showed and family history. Everybody has thyroid problems in my family. And so the minute that it was felt a little enlarged, even though I didn't have any symptoms, they just put you on medication and say that, you know what, that's it. It's going to keep getting worse as you'll just have to up the medication. That's pretty much what happens. For me, I was just so lucky in that I ended up, as I started as a physical therapist, went back to school for nutrition, and I decided to walk the walk. So just changing my diet to getting rid of processed foods and some other and sugar, all of a sudden I no longer needed the medication. So I so agree with you. But this iodine piece is really exciting, the findings, because we can deal with it. It's something that we have control over. And I know that. So why don't you fill us in on what where we're getting this excess iodine that's the problem.
Yeah, perfect question. And to build upon your story, there's a lot of people who've done various things that have seemed to help their thyroid function. They've gone off processed foods. Maybe they went gluten-free or they went autoimmune paleo. Some even have seen benefit from vegan diets. And I've struggled for a long time because some of these approaches are contradictory, And then I came to realize that a lot of different approaches can all end up lowering extra iodine. So we get it from different sources, and the sources that have gone up the most in the last few decades are processed grain products and dairy products. Breads, baked goods, bagels, croissants, rolls, cookies, muffins. And I'm not really talking about the stuff you would make at home, but things you would buy in a store that are pre-made. And many of these items can have 5 times the day's safe amount of iodine in a single serving. That's now not common. So yeah, it's gone up radically. So a lot of people will cut out gluten or processed food, and they may drop their iodine intake a lot. So those are the two that have changed the most. Other big sources, sea vegetables. Not all Americans eat them, but those that do, they contribute a lot of iodine. Some types of seafood have a lot. Thankfully, there are some that do not. Egg yolks, and then some types of salt can be high amounts. And those are the biggest dietary sources. But the ones that have changed the most have been the processed grain products and the dairy products.
Well, it's interesting because with osteoporosis, we love sea vegetables because there's so many amazing nutrients in them. And so if someone doesn't have an issue, like what do you want to what would you give them guidelines on those sea vegetables, or even the nori that people use for the sushi? Do you have any guidelines on how much of that you can have?
Well, in my world, everyone has thyroid disease. That's to whom I'm speaking.
But they do.
So,
It's so common. It's so common.
so yeah, so guidelines for safe use of sea vegetables. The two, and in my book, I talk about a process called the reset phase, where you're correcting your thyroid function, and a process called the maintenance phase. So that's where you've already done some changes, you've gotten better, or you're doing well and you want to keep it there. So in the maintenance phase, spirulina and chlorella, those are two sea vegetables to where typical serving sizes are not problematic. They're fine to include.
Interesting. So what about the dulse that's in the shaker?
Yeah, so based on quantities one would use, but one can get excess amounts of iodine. So, and there are trace minerals, but when you dig deep and you run the math on how much trace minerals are there, I've been kind of disappointed in that. So I've heard talk about they've got zinc, they've got potassium. They do. They also have aluminum, arsenic, lead, but then you get down to the actual numbers, you might get a tenth of a milligram of potassium from a serving of sea vegetables. Well, your body needs 6,000 milligrams of potassium per day. So there's a lot of stuff in there, but when you get down to the numbers, I don't think people miss out on too much. When at least those prone to thyroid disease, they can safely do without.
Interesting. And your book is incredible. And we'll go into that more in detail, but you really lay it out in terms of the different, things that have iodine in them. But what about salt? Because all salts are not created equal. So why don't
No.
you tell people what they could do about salt? Where did we find salt that doesn't have iodine in it, and which salts would you recommend?
Yeah, and that's an easy one. It's a great example to where there's a lot of parallel swaps. It's not, you don't have to really give things up. You just have to make deliberate choices. Salt, so there's iodized salt, which if that's your main salt intake, that can add an extra 250 micrograms of iodine per day. And in terms of ranges, that break even type zone, that stay healthy zone, is probably about 50 to 200 from all sources. So that's going to be like the diet, supplements, medications, any topical type things. So iodized salt could put you well above that just by itself. Another popular one that's surprised me is Himalayan salt. So
Mm.
the assays that I've seen, and I've just begged the companies, are you guys sure this is correct? Are you sure about the decimals and the zeros? And they've convinced me that they are. It's about twice the iodine as iodized salt. So that's a good one to avoid as well.
Himalayan sea salt, the healthy
Yeah,
Himalayan sea
the
salt.
pink
Wow.
Himalayan salt. Yeah.
What about the Celtic?
So with Celtic brand, they've got a couple of different subtypes of salt. They've got about a dozen different things in their product line. They're light gray salts, which they come in a fine or a coarse ground. I've seen many assays of those two, and they have basically no relevant iodine content. So those who like sea salts, that's a great option.
Any other ones that don't have any in it?
Yeah, so there's just kosher salts, especially Morton's brand and Diamond brand. A lot of chefs that I study from and follow are big fans of Diamond brand kosher salt, and it's salt. There's like nothing else in it for additives or caking ingredients. But they argue that the physical shape of the granules is the best for sticking onto food. So that's the favorite of a lot of chefs, a lot of top chefs.
Oh, very interesting. So there's really not chemicals in that one. There's just,
Yeah, no additives, nothing besides the salt. And then also most all stores you can find salt that's just non-iodized, like plain old table salt that's non-iodized. And then you can find canning and pickling salt. And those are just also plain pure salt. We used to think back when that iodine would interfere with the fermentation process. So they were made without iodine. We now know that it actually doesn't matter, but it's still it's still iodine free.
and where else are we getting? You mentioned something about what we're putting on our skin, our products.
Yeah, so this is something to where there's a work in progress with federal regulation. They've identified that we absorb about 4.5% of iodine across intact, healthy skin. And that sounds like a small amount, but iodine is something that is relevant in microgram doses. And so a grain of salt is a milligram, a microgram is a thousandth of that. So it doesn't take much to make a big difference. The FDA a couple of years ago made it illegal to use iodine in hand sanitizers. And boy, now that was thankfully that was done before the big pandemic came
Oh,
on.
can you imagine?
Yeah.
Thyroid would
Well,
have gone out off the roof. Oh my
well,
goodness.
well, for sure. So they were already seeing that many hospital workers were getting unusually high rates of thyroid disease from using iodine-based hand sanitizers all day long. So the next thing that's being worked on is looking at the content in personal care products. So I've done the math on this, and iodine again, it's a really handy chemical. It makes lotions smooth and it makes them not separate. It keeps them from from going rancid because it's a preservative. It's a highly active compound, so it's very useful. However, we can absorb it. So what I think about are the things that we use in large quantities and we put on our skin and we leave there. It's found in a lot of things like mascara or hairspray. I don't think we're using that much volume that actually gets into our bodies. I don't think that's quite as relevant. But conditioner, you got a nice full head of hair, you could easily use a lot more than I would. You could use 20, 30 grams of conditioner at a time. Or like body lotions, face creams. These things we use 10, 20, 30 grams per day, and we leave them on our skin. And if you run the math on a conditioner, say, even if it's only 0.5% an iodine-based ingredient like PVP, and even though it's only 4.5% absorbed, even though PVP is only 12.8% iodine, you still run all that math and you're left with about 2,000 micrograms you could absorb at once. So like 10 times the safe upper limit for the day.
So is organic have anything to do with it or not
Not at
really?
all. Well,
Right.
no. So big picture, I did an estimate looking at popular products, some that were more so organic or health food, some that were more conventional. It's about a quarter or a third of things that do have iodine ingredients. So it's easy to work around. PVP, Papa Victor Papa, that's the main thing in more conventional products. There's about a dozen names for that. I put that in the book too. But in the natural side, you'll see a lot of kelp extracts or sea extracts. That's actually PVP. They're just a different name for the same thing. So yeah, it's not a difference that way.
Dr. C, this is very upsetting. The person is spending lots of money. They're buying these really natural products with kelp, and it's possibly aggravating their thyroid.
Yeah, the cool thing is there are a lot of products that don't have it. More don't than do. So if yours do, just know that you got a lot of other choices out there.
Okay, so if it says any kelp, I guess you have the whole list in the book. So
Yeah.
that's great. But this is just unbelievable. And why don't you just tell us? Because there's clinical trials that have really shown some great results.
It's blown me away. One of the studies that was quite reflective of this, and you talked about Hashimoto's, they took a bunch of people that had Hashimoto's, and it strikes me as odd how they found this group. But basically, they had the disease for about 4 years. They were never medicated, and their levels were stable for the last year, but they weren't good. Their average TSH scores were about 3 times outside the normal range. So this is a marker that shows roughly how active the thyroid is. It's one thing of many, but the higher the number is, the more the thyroid is underactive. Normal labs say it's normal up to about 4.5. Many argue that probably 2 or 1 is more like good function. Anyway, these folks were at 14. Their average TSH scores were at 14. They were bad shape. And a lot of them had TSH scores like 50, 100, or 200. They were severely hypothyroid. And so for 3 months, they had them do a low iodine diet and nothing else. And what they saw was that within those 3 months, 78.3% of the people had perfectly normal, healthy thyroid function. And they did no medications, nothing else.
That's incredible. That's just so everybody listening, wow, they just should get your book. And then if they, because so many people are on thyroid medication. So if there's any issue, and then make sure you check with your doctor and keep getting tested, right?
Yeah, yeah. So that's the thing. Those on medication, if your thyroid does start to work a lot better again, you want to make sure that that's identified and adjusted. If not, the combination of what your thyroid is now making with the medicine could be too much. And that's both dangerous for your health and your bones onto itself, but also it can make it to where your thyroid is no longer given a chance to grow and heal.
What happened with me was all of a sudden my heart's palpitating. I'm having major palpitations, and I'm thinking,
Yeah.
what's going on here? And so I called up. My husband's also a physician, but I called up the endocrinologist, who said, you know what, cut your medicine in half. So I did that, and I was fine. A couple weeks later, the same thing's happening. She's like, just get off of it. But it was a little frightening. I'm thinking,
Yeah.
what? So it's such a good point. Don't just make changes without being followed. And there's so much involved in the thyroid, but that's fascinating. I just can't even get over it. So before we go, because I really want you to go into your diet that's helped people, but before we do that, let's just make the connection with bones, because there's
Yeah.
the thyroid affects everything. It affects every part of your body. And I love how you have in your book symptoms. People, that's a great little chart you have in terms of what you could be feeling. But can you just tell us about, why don't you make the connection with the bones, why this is something we really need to be aware of?
Yeah, yeah. Hormones work by receptors. So cells have special receptors that respond to hormones. Like, there's estrogen receptors in the breast tissue, for example. The only known hormone with receptor in every cell of the body are thyroid hormones. And yeah, everywhere. And the bones, they affect both the growth of new bone cells, the breakdown of old new bones, and also the whole remodeling process. They affect all of those. And with thyroid hormones, an odd thing is that there's this Goldilocks really good ideal range, and there's above and below, and a lot of the same problems happen on either end. Too little or too much can both be harmful. So with the bones, we've known forever that way too much thyroid hormone can speed the rate of bone loss, but too little thyroid hormone can slow the rate of bone growth. So they can have almost the same effects. And a really common problem, the test that I mentioned, the TSH, it's something to where it's the brain telling the thyroid to work and to grow, but it's also talking to our bones. It also tells the bones how to grow and how to repair properly. So many people are on medication that's a little more than they need. And sadly, a lot of doctors don't know that it's bad to have the TSH levels too low, but it is. The TSH is needed for your bones as well. So if thyroid is just slightly high or low, we can't get proper bone repair.
That's so fascinating. In terms of the values, do you feel comfortable talking about the
Sure,
values?
for
Because
sure.
it's different, different. And sometimes they only do like a screening test, like one test. So maybe fill people into what really a good evaluation, what should be looked at.
For sure. So we mentioned the TSH, and that's the only one of these things that's backward, to where high is low and low is high. That's the brain asking the thyroid to work. So if you've got a lazy worker, the boss yells at them, right? So that's why it's higher when it's low. Now, the other things we measure are the products from the thyroid, and that's the T3 and T4. They do those both in total forms and free forms. The free forms are preferred nowadays, they're a little more accurate. And there's also thyroid antibodies. Those are the immune cells that can be present when someone's attacking their thyroid. And in terms of ranges, we've got a normal reference range, and it's a good starting place. It's how it comes about is it's an average from the scores of those who get thyroid tests. And you take an average, you put it into a bell curve distribution, and you say, okay, this is high, this is low. Well, the drawback is that those who have thyroid, those who are getting the most thyroid tests are not people that have the best thyroid function. Well, by definition, they have thyroid disease. They're being monitored. They should be monitored, or they've got symptoms. They're saying, "Hey, I've got this. My hair's falling out. My heart's racing." The doctor says, "Oh, let's test your thyroid." So there's a whole lot more people like that. It's a biased group where most of them have abnormal thyroid issues, and they skew that average. So there have been many studies done saying, what if you look at people that have no symptoms, no history of thyroid disease, no medications, it would skew their thyroid, they're not pregnant, da 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 da. What if you take folks that have every reason to have good thyroid function and you average their scores? And what we see in those cases is that the TSH is the most different from optimal versus normal. In healthy people, the TSH is on the low side of normal. It's not below normal, but it's on the low side of that. So the normal range is about zero point 0.4 to 4.5 by almost all laboratory standards. But healthy people, and to be really precise, I'm talking about adults under age 70, no cardiovascular disease, not pregnant. So people in those categories, we're thinking about like 0.4 to 1.9 or 2. That's about where almost all their scores lie. There's also been data showing that those who are a little above that are normal or a little below that, they're seeing more health complications, which can be bone issues, cancer risks, heart disease. Now, the other markers, the T3, T4, in healthy people, there's a lot of variation in T3. They're all anywhere can be normal almost. And T4, they're on the low side of normal as well. So one wouldn't guess that, but that's how it plays out when it's studied in healthy populations.
So that's really interesting because you could go and the doctor says your tests are fine. They fall in the reference range, let's say
Yeah.
your TSH, but it really isn't. You could still have issues because the reference range, as you said, was with people who aren't healthy. So that there's different reference ranges. And I think that's why in functional medicine, they really use different numbers in terms of what's healthy and what isn't. Wow.
Mhm.
Very interesting. So there's so many reasons. And the good news, I think this is so good. I just know for myself, just the thought that no one thinks you can get off medication. And not that everybody can, but that the fact that there's so much that can be done to help your thyroid is just not known. I guess because the medicine works, people go on and they don't, it doesn't have to be that way. So fill
Yeah,
it.
and there's two big sides to that. So there's how much your body makes and how your body responds to that. So there's a lot of folks to where they don't have a thyroid or their thyroid is shrunk to pretty much nothing, and yet they can take a dose of a medicine that on paper should be all their body needs, and yet so many of them are still symptomatic. They're still suffering. So what we now know is that iodine. I talked about how it can damage the thyroid. That's part of it. But what happens is before there's thyroid damage, the thyroid slows itself in the exposure to extra iodine. So what happens there is if it didn't have a backup mechanism, extra iodine would cause it to dump out too much hormone. So the way you felt when you were taking more than you needed, if that were ongoing all the time, that could damage someone's heart. So our thyroid not only shuts itself down, but our heart and our muscles and our other cells, they fight thyroid hormones. They block thyroid hormones when there's too much iodine present. It's a safety mechanism. So, because of that, yeah, there are those that will need medication long term. If they're still symptomatic, then that's often a big part of that. And they can still benefit by iodine regulation, even if there's no real plausible hope of them having their thyroid come back again.
Right? They can even just reduce. Wow. So tell us, walk us through the process with your diet because it's really novel, how your approach to it, but it's supported by the research and you've seen such incredible results. So
Yeah, and it's crazy simple. If someone has a lot of food preferences or they're paleo vegan, you can do that. You don't have to change anything that way. Or if you're just generally eating healthy. So what I did was they've used low iodine diets for quite a while in medicine for scans, like a 2-week thing before someone does an iodine uptake scan. And in those contexts, they didn't really have to think very hard about, variety or healthy food. They said, yeah, just cut all this stuff out for 2 weeks. And for a short term, why not? Why not just make it easy? But that's really not a good way to live for many months. So I made it to where it was nutritionally complete, good foods, whole foods. And I just scoured to put together databases of iodine content for more than 600 foods. You can't really find that otherwise. And I put them into green, yellow, and red light ranges. So when someone gets going, most that start it have active thyroid disease and symptoms they want to improve. So they would go in the reset phase. And the reset phase is eat the green light foods. It's that easy, eat the way you would eat and just focus on those in the green light. And I talk all about ways you can easily substitute the yellow and red light foods for things that are in the green light category. So it's just green light foods. And once someone then does get to good place with their thyroid, their symptoms are better, they've got the option of adding in up to 2 servings of yellow light foods per day. So it's really simple that way.
So once they get a little better, you're saying their symptoms, you can up it a little bit in terms of the iodine.
Well, and that's the thing is that we all have some level of iodine tolerance. We can all tolerate a certain amount of fluctuation. And once we've healed our thyroid, we get more tolerance back again. So we've got more range to work within.
So if someone, let's say for like me, I don't have any symptoms anymore and I'm not on any medication, but it would be smart just to not have excessive, because if I do have Hashimoto's, right, it'd be a good idea to cut I don't know how, I have to really, after this, I'm going to have to really evaluate it.
Yeah,
But
so with Hashimoto's, what happens is you form antibodies against thyroglobulin and or thyroid peroxidase. And thyroglobulin antibodies form because thyroglobulin just has too much iodine on it. And thyroid peroxidase, that's the enzyme. Its sole job is to oxidize iodide into iodine. So in high iodine states, your body attacks it. So the direct mechanism of action for both those antibodies to form is too much iodine in the thyroid. And yeah, you're right. Just looking out for the excess is the best way to cut the risk of that recurring.
and it's not a big deal. This is really, really simple. And your book is great because you do have all the substitutions. So the question is though, then if you reduce the iodine in terms of a person who doesn't have any issues, should they, and will actually, if you reduce the iodine, will there be a change in the antibodies? Do you actually see that clinically?
Quite commonly so. A case like yourself, where you're not on treatment, you could probably do fine just to jump on the maintenance stage. But there have been papers showing that thyroid peroxidase, for example, that a change of 100 micrograms of iodine intake per day can correspond with 1,000-point reduction of thyroid peroxidase antibodies.
That's huge.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
Wow, this is just incredible because it's an easy tweak. I mean, you're not asking people to even really change their diet. But on the other hand, we have to be fair. If they're eating French fries and a horrible diet and well, you're saying even if they eat this horrible diet and reduce their iodine, their
No,
thyroid will get better.
you bring up a really good point. In the book, I did talk a lot about the idea of, yeah, there's many ways you could, you could take almost any one variable, like any one rule, and find ways to make a crappy diet. So like if your one rule was don't eat animal foods, you can do Snickers and ding dongs and whatever else and all kinds of junk. So yeah, you can always find ways to cheat that way. And I did talk about, we know that excess fat in the organs is also harmful for the thyroid. There's certain food categories that in excess are harmful. There's certain micronutrients that are helpful in addition to others like selenium and zinc. So I worked hard to say, here's some things you want to get. Here's some good ratios of macronutrients to think about. You want some of all your macros, and you want to have your weight at a good range. So there are other considerations, but yeah, the biggest single factor is the iodine.
So let's just talk about selenium for a second, because there's an easy tweak for every person listening. Am I
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Why don't you tell everybody? Because this is something that can really be healthy. And most people, I don't know how many people do this. So
We've known this forever, and it's kind of an odd thing because it seems that there are parallel but distinct benefits to dietary selenium and supplemental selenium. I can't think of many similar examples of that, but yeah, there's benefits both ways. In dietary, there's tons of good food sources. There are some versions of selenium that can bioaccumulate and some that cannot. So the coolest thing is that Brazil nuts are rich in selenium. Their amount can vary a lot from like crop to crop and batch to batch. But we now know that the form of selenium they have is one that really cannot bioaccumulate. There were some studies done, which I don't know if they would have asked me if the study was a good idea, I would have said no, but they've been done and now we have the data. But they gave preschool children in Brazil, and this was a pretty large group of kids that were malnourished. They were like stunted and not growing properly. And they gave them for you what would be the equivalency for you and me of about like 40 Brazil nuts per day. It was like, no, yeah, it was like a quarter to a third of their whole caloric intake was Brazil nuts for many months. And what they saw was they measured selenium. There's a lot of ways you can measure selenium in the body's usage and also when it's becoming toxic. And they were getting rid of extra selenium. It was in their hair and their nails, but the ways it would become toxic internally were not happening. The body could do very well with it. So yeah, there are some other more exotic foods that have a lot of selenium that can build up and can be harmful, but we can pretty well regulate the selenium in Brazil nuts. When we get enough, we'll get rid of the extra. So I encourage 2 to 4 Brazil nuts as a regular thing per day.
Yeah, I do that as well. And it's so wonderful. So I was happy when I saw that in your book, how great that was, because right, it's another easy tweak. Wow, this is fabulous. I just love the work that you did. And just with people listening, maybe just go over the symptoms for a minute so people might know, could this be them? Like what, because the thyroid affects so many people, but what things should people be looking for? Be on the lookout.
Yeah, there's the classic symptoms that I'll mention, but the big orienting concept is that something changed along the way. Like you can point to a time frame in which it was clearly different. We have our various, I don't know, weak links or broken fuses that may be long term. We've had our whole life, and those are not always as suspicious. But if there's a time frame, you can say, oh yeah, like my weight, I would eat reasonably well and do some exercise, and my weight wasn't too bad. But then ever since last March, it was all different. So there's a clear time frame. And yeah, body weight, so easy weight gain. Or the other side of that is someone will say, I used to be able to drop 5, 10 pounds if I needed to, and now that doesn't work anymore. The same things don't work. So yeah, so weight loss resistance. Hair, so hair loss and hair thinning. Now with women, it's mostly diffuse and even when it's from the thyroid. If it's more so in certain areas, like just the like male pattern thinning, for example, it could be other factors. Or if it's patchy, it could be something else. But diffuse and even thinning and then weak and brittle hair can often be a sign of thyroid disease. Menstrual irregularities, drier skin, IBS, and then also just weight and energy are like two sides of a coin. So when the body is just socking everything away and not burning it, well, you're not getting gas to the tank. You're not getting energy out of that. So you're tired. You don't really enjoy exercise. You don't recover from it well. And then your brain is power hungry. So when energy is not being burned well, we get forgetful. We get brain fog. Our mood gets lower. So yeah, those are some of the biggest symptoms of that.
Yeah. And the good news, though, there's good news that there's hope and there's things that can be done. I mean, to me, that's exciting. And this iodine is amazing, the missing piece that it's just not the first thing by any means that people have talked about. So I really applaud you for delving into this, bringing this, and your book makes it very easy. Your book goes step by step in terms of what people can do. So I think it's just really terrific. You did a fabulous job.
Well, and if just one more thing to throw on there, I think about the late night infomercials where they say, but wait, there's more. So the 70.3%, that's already pretty darn good, right? Well, but what about the others? So of those that didn't get better, there was those to whom a couple different things happened. So one of which was they actually got better, but they weren't yet normal. I said some people, their TSH scores were 100 or more. So they came down by half or better. And had they been given more time, perhaps they would have normalized, but they didn't get counted in that 70.3% because they weren't yet normal. Another big group of them, when they did measure their iodine afterward, they weren't in the targeted range. So either they had so much they had not gotten rid of it, or there were some sources they had not uncovered just yet, but they weren't really yet at a place where it could have been helpful for them. And then the last group was those to where they did eliminate iodine and their thyroid scores just didn't budge. That was about 2% of people. So everybody else either didn't somehow do it long enough or just wasn't given enough time. But yeah, it was just ridiculously effective.
That's unbelievable. And how did they measure? Is it something, do you have patients get measured or it's really
Yeah,
hard to
yeah.
do?
Yeah, great question. So logically, one would think, hey, I should check my iodine and see if this would be for me. The drawback is, let me back up one more step. There is one useful iodine test. It's not by far the most common test available, but it's useful. And this is a urinary iodine to creatinine ratio. Now, the amount of iodine in our urine varies tremendously based on how active our kidneys are. Urinary creatinine helps us see how active our kidneys are in that moment. So if we calibrate iodine against creatinine, it helps for that. However, the studies have shown that your levels before going on a diet do not predict your response to the diet. And that's because you could have a lot of it trapped in the thyroid that's not yet coming out. So it's not useful beforehand. But if someone's been doing things really well for 3 months and nothing budged, that can be useful. And if there's a lot coming out, then either they just haven't finished detoxing yet, or they've missed some iodine sources. If they are below 50 micrograms of iodine per gram of creatinine, that's how the report comes out. So below 50, if they've been below 50 for several months and they've not budged, probably won't be helpful for them. And that's rather rare, but that's just how that plays out. If they're above 50, they need more time and they might need to scour more closely for hidden sources of iodine.
Oh, thank you. That's really very helpful.
And just to be totally clear, this is not a urinary iodine test. So when someone gets a urinary iodine test, it's not the same thing. This is a very distinct subtype called the urinary iodine to creatinine ratio.
Oh, well, thank you so much for clarifying that. So your book has so much in it, but you have some bonuses as well. Tell us about the bonuses. You made it even juicier for people.
Well, this is cool. Yeah, if you go to thyroidresetdiet.com and just bring your receipt back afterward, right now, this is a funny thing. So, as an author, so I'm an author and I'm a member of Amazon Prime, which is not a very elite group. But if I go on Amazon Prime today, I can buy the book for $12.42. If I write to Penguin Random House and I say, "Hey, look, I wrote this book. I want to buy a case of these books," I can buy a case of the books for about $16 per book.
That's crazy. That's so
So
crazy.
you can buy a book for $12. You can go on thyroidresetdiet.com and you can get an $18 gift card for our store. So you can actually earn money on that. And we've got a lot of bonus recipes and other cool things. But yeah, it's a great window of opportunity right now.
Oh, and you also, we should mention though, there's recipes in the book. You have
There are.
recipes in the book, and
Yep.
yeah, so that's
Even
it.
more for the bonus. I love to cook. My wife and I do, and it's so easy to do things that are making substitutions to make it healthy and make the iodine levels reasonable. So it's been a blast to put those together and test them all out.
Wow, well, I can't wait to hear from people because this is a tweak that, as we said, it's not really known. It's not like your doctors can say, "Oh, make sure." Am I right about that?
You're
I mean, some
right.
of some of the doctors do say, keep your iodine low, like sushi and things, not to do that more than twice a week, but that would be very high. Am I right in terms of
It could be, yeah.
yeah, yeah. But regardless, this is just fabulous. And I just hope it helps lots of people because so many people have thyroid and so many people have Hashimoto's. And it's just, as we said, so extremely common. And there's good news. And I can't thank you. Is there any last minute things you want to leave people with before we end?
Just to build upon what you're saying, I'm really appreciative to be here with you and get a chance to share this with more because we're hearing stories just pouring in already. It's been like the data from the studies. And I've worked in thyroid disease for 25 years in practice and years before then. And I've never seen results happen like this for people. So I'm just very thankful for any way to share this. Listeners, please do know that this can help. And if there's loved ones in your life that have thyroid disease, please let them know that there may be options they didn't know about.
Oh, well, thank you, because this is, again, I like easy. I teach happiness and I really don't like overwhelm, but this is easy. And this is something that we can all do without really much problem at all. And again, your book has all the substitutions. So thank you. It's really been a pleasure. And thank you for all the work and research you've done to make such a difference. So, all
Oh, thanks for being here. Good to connect.
right, take care. Thanks again. Bye-bye. I hope you enjoyed my interview with Dr. Christianson and now have a better understanding of your thyroid and how something so simple as reducing the iodine content in the food you eat can have a major, profound effect on the health of your thyroid. It's all good news. And the best news is that Dr. Christianson outlines this step by step in his new book, The Thyroid Reset Diet. So I have the links for that in the show notes, as well as the link so that you can get all the bonuses that Dr. Christianson talked about. So 2 other things I wanted to tell you. One is that if you want a consult or a second opinion, you can just go to thyroidopinion.com and be connected with Dr. Christianson. And lastly, after we finished the interview, he mentioned one other sea salt that doesn't have iodine, and it's Maldon, Maldon, that he truly likes. So bye for now, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.